Hi, I'm Andrew Sears, and in this lecture, I'm going to talk about how to develop a plan to operationalize values and avoid mission drift. Now, to put this in framing, this lecture is a part of a course where there's 8 weeks, and in last week, you developed your theological vision, building on the Wesleyan quadrilateral that you have been building skills on and competencies on throughout the course. And in this week, the whole point of this whole course is to develop a plan where you're going to try to operationalize the values to avoid mission drift in line with your theological vision. Now, I want to kind of do a recap of the whole course to explain how this fits in. So there's this biblical pattern of secularization where, Israel, turns to God for help. God redeems and blesses Israel. Israel becomes complacent and turns to other gods, and then Israel goes into bondage. And there's an equivalent of that happens in ministries. So you have a new movement, a new ministry becomes affluent, and then society's cultural values change, and then the organization must change to be marginalized, and often the organization secularizes. So what we're trying to do, at least one part of this, is how do you avoid this? How do you create, operationalize your values? And one of the other things about this is, society's changing and the rate of change in society is accelerating. So with organizations, this is a stages of organizations graph. So, they go through startup, growth, maturity, and then decline. What happens a lot of times is the environment. So if this is an organization's whole system and strategy, change happens in the environment, and the theological vision needs to adapt, including all the elements of strategy. But how do you do that? That's a big part of what we're trying to do. And right now, the ministries that are facing this the most are often ministries in progressive cities that require better, what's called cultural contextualization. But also a lot of ministries need to do this because they've grown a lot, and they have increased pressure to get competence, more competent staff over values alignment. And then there's also pressures from client diversity, where the nature of the clients has changed. So all of these require adaptation. Now, what has to happen in this to navigate the current crisis, you want to stay true to Scripture without secularizing, but you also need to innovate and avoid becoming irrelevant or not keeping up with rapidly changing society. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is, I believe, without better navigation, without ministries improving their competencies in this navigation, 25% will successfully adapt, 25% will secularize, 25% will become irrelevant by not adapting. And if you're lucky, you're in the 25% of the domain that you're not going to need to adapt because there aren't as many changes. Now, another way of framing this, if you take values alignment and professionalization, you take the cultural center of your organization, traditional faith-based organizations that are smaller, often as they grow, they have to get more professionalized staff, and then they become a traditional faith-based organization, and then a critical mass faith-based organization. And what happens is you're getting more and more professional staff, but there's this thing called the frontier of staff quality that there's an actual trade-off between, can you get someone whose values aligned, and can you get people who are professional. So what we're trying to do is to break that frontier of staff quality by doing something. So that's the whole point of this plan. You wrote a theological vision. Now you're trying to have a plan to operationalize your theological vision. And one thing I want to emphasize on this is we are based in a knowledge economy. Most ministries, if you're going to stay functional, if you're not going to secularize and your staff are going to be competent, you're going to have to do 5 to 10 times more training and education. We can't keep operating like we're in an industrial economy where people stay in the same job for 40 years and nothing changes. We're in a knowledge economy that's always changing. All companies that stay up, they're investing heavily in their staff training. So that's a big part of your plan here. Now, so what you're trying to do is to create this operationalize this plan to operationalize values and avoid mission drift. And so this is really the last part of this, the goals of the course that you're trying to do in this. So The framing for this is again from Tim Keller's Center Church, and throughout this course, what you've been doing is reflecting on what you believe, and then using practical theology to create a theological vision. And now that you have a theological vision, the big issue is to try to make sure there's strategic alignment so that you're doing what you're saying you're doing. And that's really, really hard to do. It's just as hard as it is to do is, whenever Paul said, I do the things I don't want to do, and I don't do the things I want to do. For organizations, that same thing's true for us. So how do you get your ministry expression aligned with your theological vision? Now, as you design your this plan, that's the ministry expression, that's what you're doing here. It can be helpful to think about where you fall in terms of the typology of faith-based organizations. And a lot of what you're going to be implementing will depend on where you are on this typology. So if you're a critical mass faith-based organization, there's a lot of strategies, and I'm going to focus a little bit more on this because I think that this is where the biggest risk point happens for a lot of ministries, is whenever they become critical mass and they don't have strategies to offset that. So I have a whole lecture on typology of faith-based organizations where I kind of go through all the details of this. This is just a general guide of patterns that I've seen in the conversations that I've had with thousands of ministries. These aren't hard rules, but they're general guidelines. So probably the most important thing you're going to do for your organization is think about how you are enforcing religious hiring requirements. So, if, and also statements of faith and things along those lines. So, for a lot of, and what statement of faith do you use? So, there's kind of a statement of faith that's aligned with the National Association of Evangelicals. And that's generally going to be more theologically conservative, and typically is not going to be aligned with the beliefs of Catholics or theologically liberal denominations. So a lot of these organizations generally are going to be use a statement of faith like that. Their critical mass faith-based organizations might use either National Association of Evangelicals or World Evangelical Alliance is similar. And then the Apostles' Creed or Nicene Creed, there's a lot of similarities between those. They're more theologically broad and inclusive of Catholics, but typically will exclude, groups like Mormons. And then, statement of faith for a protected pluralist often is going to be very strict for your protected tier. That's where you might have a core staff, like the Salvation Army officers that required to follow, the denominational beliefs. And then you have this amorphous pluralist. Typically all you're doing is saying, do you support our religious mission? So one key thing to think about is what are the best practices for statement of faith and religious hiring requirements. So ensure your statement of faith is aligned with your position in the faith-based organization typology. Sometimes I see organizations that are misaligned and they're using the wrong statement of faith because they haven't really thought through it. Determine where you're drawing a firm boundary in hiring. So, depending on your mission, if you're a denominational church, you're going to hire within your denomination, right? If you're non-denominational but conservative theologically, that may, determine who you hire. So, you have to determine which of the following are in or out. Is someone who's committed Catholic, are they in or out for you? Or non-evangelicals or Christians from liberal denominations, Mormons, etc. You have to know that. Then determine where you're following a critical mass strategy. So, for example, you're going to have the majority of senior leadership team will have conservative theological beliefs, be Protestant, etc. Often critical mass strategies are only explicit to senior management and board. And then number 4 is ensure your statement of faith and related policies align with your religious hiring practices. And then 5 is to have a legal counsel review. So there's the Alliance Defending Freedom Ministry Alliance will provide that as a service to members. And it's tricky to maintain the right balance of not over-defining where you're getting into legalism or under-defining boundaries. And sometimes, depending on how you define this, could create more legal risk for you. So for a lot of ministries, working with the Alliance Defending Freedom may be a really good strategy. So if you're most traditional, critical mass, protected pluralist, that's going to probably make sense for you. Typically, the more theologically conservative you are, the more that you would want to join that, and also the more of their checklist items you'd want to follow. I'll show you their checklist. Typically, the amorphous, pluralist, faith-based organizations are not going to join Alliance Defending Freedom. Now, the Alliance Defending Freedom recommendations are a part of a checklist that's a much larger checklist we provide, but you can join them at the Alliance Defending Freedom Alliance or ADF Ministry Alliance, and they have different recommendations. So have a statement of faith, and depending on the type of organization you have, these may or may not be important. Different levels of importance to you. So statement on marriage and sexuality, statement on sanctity of human life, statement of final authority for matters of faith and conduct. And they have a document that explains all these: a religious mission statement, a code of Christian conduct, and then have the following policies and procedures: religious employment criteria, assigned statement of faith, religious job descriptions. A lot of times people say, well, we only hire Christians, but there's no element of a job description that relates back to their Christian faith, which creates problems for religious hiring rights if you have a legal challenge. Facility use policy, and then emphasizing religious character throughout the organization. So again, where you fit in the typology of faith-based organizations will determine the extent that you want to follow any or all of these. Now, I want to talk about some of the principles of critical mass strategy, because critical mass strategy is one of the most important adaptations, and it's really difficult to do right. So if you are in a more cosmopolitan city, it's going to be more difficult for you, and you might be thinking about a critical mass strategy. So the idea behind critical mass is you're having a little bit more fluid boundaries with the goal of having a critical mass at various tiers of your organization. So you might allow non-Christians at some tiers, or you might allow people who are maybe a little looser with your values. And you're trying to ensure a critical mass needed to sustain culture and also to protect core leadership. Now, I don't advise critical mass across staff, because for a variety of legal reasons and even historical reasons, I've never seen an organization from the 50 plus historical books I've read and thousands of organizations I've interacted with, I've never seen an organization that didn't have a firm boundary on religious hiring rights, at least at some tier of their organization, that didn't secularize. Having said that, ultimately, you can sort out what you're going to do in terms of critical mass strategy. So the point here is that typically you want to have only hire practicing Christians with a signed statement of faith, and you need to have a clear policy on that. Now, historically, a lot of organizations would allow non-Christian volunteers. This is starting to create more legal problems, especially if there are volunteer paths that could move into regular staff paths, because there's been legal challenges where someone would start off as a volunteer in an organization. There's a legal challenge, I think, in Washington State where someone was a volunteer legal counsel, and then they applied for a regular legal counsel job and they were disallowed, and it was problematic that they had hired or they had brought on a non-Christian volunteer and they couldn't move into a staff position. Now, that may be less of an issue for things like if you're having them serve soup at your ministry, but you need to talk with a legal counsel. So, there's different things that you can think about: having a required statement of faith for volunteers and or faculty if you're a Christian university, having moral criteria for small group leaders in a church, and getting an agreement from faculty to stay within theological boundaries, or other volunteers to teach within that. Now, the most common place where you see critical mass really is at the client, where what you're trying to do, or with universities, it's for students, where what you're trying to do is you have policies to ensure a critical mass of the culture you're trying to encourage growth towards for each tier of programs. For example, you might have a dry shelter to improve the safety of both staff and those staying, or you could decide to have a wet shelter and then have another tier of, where there's increased safety for people if they're sober. Just because part of the issue with wet shelters where people can come in if they've been drinking is that there's generally less safety. So there could be other things of do you have a decision of faith before entering a Christian recovery program, or are you making it clear to non-Christian clients or students that they're going to be taught with Christian perspective, and keeping the idea that the way most churches run is anyone can come to church, but it's clear that a Bible-based sermon will be preached. So the idea behind critical mass with clients or constituents, or this should be parishioners or students, is that you're trying to shape the culture. And for this is most commonly at Christian universities, where you might have 10 to 20% of people who don't share the core faith or aren't very strong in their faith, but it's not diluting the whole culture. Where, say, you're trying to be conservative theologically, and over half your students aren't Christians, and they're getting drunk and high and having sex on the weekends, just like the typical college student would have, and then that's distorting your whole culture. That's the thing that you want to avoid. And the same type of thing could happen in any type of program. So the idea is that you're allowing, there's plenty of rescue missions that will have different tiers of programs, and at various tiers you may allow non-Christians or Christians in, or various levels of commitment. So that's one idea behind critical mass strategy. Another thing that I want to go into is thinking about risk of various funding streams and support streams. Now, as societies secularize, and you can look at different countries to see how friendly they are to faith-based organizations, you start to see certain things off the table. And it also depends on how conservative theologically you're going to be. So the more conservative you are theologically, the more risk that these things are going to have. So, the first thing to go would be government funding. But then after that, you get secular foundations and corporate grants, where they may decide that, if you don't support, they may not like your religious hiring rights. Usually that's where it goes, but it could be over other things. And then you might run into issues, if you do a lot of fundraising locally in your community, you may lose the ability to have positive PR with local news agencies. So it may be that the majority of the articles on you are hostile to you. So this may happen over time, and you have to be able to assess, do you have things in place that can help you deal with that? So then you have non-Christian donors. So say the media turns against you, and you've been around for 100 years, and you've been known as the organization that serves the homeless and the addicted in your community, but a lot of your non-Christian donors might quit funding you because they're reading these negative articles from you. And then in some cities, you start to run into problems where someone, often the mayor, decides that they want to target you because it's going to be politically advantageous for them for whatever political agenda they have. So they decide to not allow you to get zoning for any new buildings or things along those lines. So, and we've seen all these cases happen with different ministries. And then, there's so much negative press, you start to see that some of your wealthy and upper middle class Christian donors, they start to think, someone said that you guys are a hate group suddenly, and they don't want to give to a hate group, even though the group that's calling you a hate group might be more justified that group actually itself is a hate group, but they're just slinging mud at you. And often, the people who are wealthy are, and the reason why I put them in this category is often they're more concerned about status. So do they want to give to an organization that someone said is a hate group? And then you start to lose middle class and below Christian donors. and then you can have loss of tax exempt status. So in much of the world, religious, faith-based organizations, social service organizations don't have tax exempt status. So in much of the world, this is just the norm. So in parts of the world that might be Muslim or other groups, you're just not going to have a lot of the positive things that are associated with being in say America. And then one of the most protected tiers is earned income. So a lot of ministries will have earned income from thrift stores or catering services or other things. It's worth stating that that's one of the last things to go. People just want to buy clothes at thrift stores, so they don't really care. A lot of ministries are starting to invest more of their revenue portfolio around earned income because it is more protected. And then church-based donations. So this is coming from evangelical churches, and then for some churches where tithe may go because people decide that you're too conservative or too whatever. And then there's plenty of countries where you can't be a Christian organization. You can't legally be allowed to exist. So these are the risk of what can happen. So part of what we're trying to do is develop a operationalized plan that can deal with over 20, 40, 50, 60 years. How do you have systems in place that, as some of these things might happen, do you have systems in place that can help resist that? So what we have, and in the next video, the next lecture, I'm going to talk about this checklist to operationalize values and avoid mission drift, and then using that checklist as a plan to operationalize values and avoid mission drift.